Good evening, everyone. Welcome in. Thank you for joining us for the culminating event of this year's 1619 Education Conference. As you're entering, feel free to let us know where you're watching from in the chat. We would love to know. Okay, let's get started. So as I said, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Keynote, the 1619 Project, the work that remains. My name is Kendra Grissom, and I am the Pulitzer Center K-12 intern supporting 1619 programming, and I have the honor to be the moderator for this session. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Nicole Hannah-Jones is unable to join us this evening. We apologize for any inconvenience, and we are grateful for your continued patience and support for this conference. We are excited to continue the conversation on the impact of the 1619 Project and the work there is still to do with Dr. Martha Jones. Before we begin the conversation, I will briefly introduce the Pulitzer Center as an organization and our esteemed panelists. Following the introduction, Dr. Jones and I will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we will turn to your questions. Your voice is important to us, and we want to help you stay connected in conversation or to the conversation by posing questions. So at any point during the conversation, feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function. If your question is for a specific panelist, we ask that you indicate their name in your question. We will try to get to as many of your audience questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. To introduce the Pulitzer Center, I will share its mission. The Pulitzer Center raises awareness of underreported global issues through direct support for quality journalism and a unique program of education and public outreach. The Pulitzer Center is a proud education partner of the 1619 Project. Our 1619 Education Network consists of teams of educators from across the country who collaborate together with Pulitzer Center staff, journalists, and historians to create, teach, and share curricular resources utilizing the 1619 Project. This conference is a culminating celebration of their works and efforts. As I mentioned earlier, we are honored to have Dr. Martha S. Jones with us for tonight's keynote. She is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Jones is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, selected as one of Time's 100 must-read books for 2020. Her 2018 book, Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in the Antebellum America, was winner of the Organization of Historians Liberty Legacy Award, Best Book in Civil Rights History. And Dr. Jones, correct me if I'm wrong, this is like one of the first works on like 19th century America to receive that kind of honor, right? Yes, awesome. The book also received the American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize for Best Book in American Legal History, the American Society for Legal History John Philip Reed Book Award, Best Book in Anglo-American Legal History, and the Baltimore City Historical Society Scholars Honor for 2020. Professor Jones is also author of All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, and co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, together with many articles and essays. Professor Jones is a public historian, writing for broader audiences at the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, Talking Points Memo, Politico, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and Time. She is an exhibition curator for Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation at the William L. Clements Library, and an expert consultant for museum, film, and video production with the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, PBS American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Netflix, in Arte, France. I'm not sure about the pronunciation there. Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the CUNY School of Law, which bestowed upon her the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa, in 2019. Prior to her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City, recognized for her work with a Charles H. Refson Fellowship on the future of the city of New York at Columbia University. Professor Jones is an immediate past co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, and today serves on the boards of the Society of American Historians, the National Women's History Museum, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, the Johns Hopkins University Press, the Journal of African American History, and Slavery and Abolition. Dr. Jones penned the essay Citizenship in the 1619 Project anthology. Citizenship outlines the struggle to achieve citizenship, documenting how Black activists played a foundational role in establishing birthright citizenship in the US as a standard today. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for being here with us this evening.
Thank you for having me, Kendra. I'm thrilled to be here. And sounds like you all have been having an amazing day and a half. So let's continue with that.
Okay, so let's jump right into the conversation, shall we? Okay, so one of the things that we at the Pulitzer Center most appreciate about the 1619 Project, or rather DJ and I, is the way it takes historical scholarship that is often not engaged with outside of the university setting, and uses journalism and media to make it accessible to a general audience. I know folks are often trying to do similar work, but the 1619 Project has been successful, and that appears to have affected both the fields of history and journalism. I love to hear about how you think the project has impacted the field of history in particular. What does the project show us about the ways in which the fields of history and journalism intersect?
Yeah, in some sense, we could say that's a very old story. The great W.E.B. Du Bois, renowned still for his work of history, Black Reconstruction, was also the editor of the NAACP's Crisis. So I think in a way, when we sit here in 2023, to think about the relationship between history and journalism, we have enormous, tremendous, powerful shoulders on which to stand. But it's also true that with the publication of the 1619 Project, first the magazine, later the book, more recently the Hulu series, I think that we've seen some of the tensions that still run through the relationship between history and journalism, some of them tough. I think that we have seen exposed the ways in which historians look to function as gatekeepers and arbiters of historical knowledge, historical understanding, publishing in the realm of history. It's a narrow view, but it's a view that has really been subject to kind of heightened scrutiny in the wake of the 1619 Project. And I think that's a point of reflection for historians going forward. Do we want to function as gatekeepers at all? Should we? And if we do, what precisely is that role? The other thing I think that the project has more laudably invited is for all of us to show our work. That is to say, to pull back the curtain or to lift the hood and to make more apparent to readers, to followers, how historians do their work. There was a study done last year by the American Historical Association and the American Association for State and Local History that surveyed Americans trying to understand better, not simply did they, history, yes or no, thumbs up or thumbs down, but really trying to understand how Americans wanted to encounter the kind of work that historians do. And one of the answers that really stuck with me was that folks wanted to see how the sausage was made, so to speak. They didn't only want to discover our conclusions, but they wanted also to see how we arrived at our conclusions. And in that way, I think the 1619 Project has been exemplary for providing an opportunity, sometimes, by way of criticism, but nonetheless, we have all really worked hard to show how we arrive at our conclusions. And the last bit maybe is self-evident, but it's worth saying that I think many more historians have been encouraged, beckoned, cajoled, and more to be more public. You and I, Kendra, have talked many times about, the limitations of the seminar room where we do a great deal of our work, or even the limitations of professional conferences. I can remember the American Historical Association meeting when during a panel that touched just preliminarily on the 1619 Project. I can remember Nicole Hannah-Jones entering that room, and it was an epic moment when this inner sanctum of the profession was now more porous and was seeking out many more voices. And I walked a bit with Nicole through the book exhibit, which at our conferences is the place where everybody meets and greets, and watched people drawn to her, wanting to talk more about the project with her. So this pull to have us be more accessible, more porous, more public, I think is one of the great gifts that the 1619 Project has really bequeathed to historians. And I see so many more folks stepping in to that invitation.
No, I agree. It is exciting, the pathways that it's opening. And so one of the things about the 1619 Project is it's making accessible, hard histories, a hard history of the United States, discussing the legacies of enslavement that people may not have had prior knowledge of. And speaking about hard histories and thinking about moving beyond, now that we have the anthology, we have the series, we're becoming aware what is the work that lies ahead. I would like to pivot the conversation to talk more about your work as the director of the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project. So could you tell us a bit about that project and what inspired you to take up that work?
Sure. The short version of our story is that we come into being in the fall of 2020 because Johns Hopkins University learns that our founder and namesake, Johns Hopkins, was not exactly the Quaker abolitionist that we had long believed him to be, that we had long held him out as being. We learned that Mr. Hopkins had been an enslaver, that he had held enslaved people in his household. We learned this by way of some slim but important evidence, US Census returns from 1840 and 1850. And this is a difficult moment for the institution because, in a sense, in the way that the 1619 Project has asked us to rethink the origin story of the nation on a smaller but really powerful scale at Johns Hopkins, we now have to rethink our origin story and ask not only how did we forget this dimension of Mr. Hopkins's life, but what does it mean then for us as an institution to link our founding to that history of enslavement in the 19th century United States? Here, the Hard History at Hopkins Project comes in to really importantly challenge orthodoxy, right? Those old stories that we tell as if they are truths, to look at myths that undergird our institution, just as there are myths that undergird the life of this nation. We shatter silences places where places where no one has asked the question about the history of the university. And we also wrestle with partial truths, right? The ways in which through self-promotion, through self-interest, through only a gentle hand on steering the university's understanding of itself. We're here to do archival research, to tell new stories, stories that frankly are not so different from the founding of many, many institutions of higher education in the United States. So we are part of a collective, both across the country in colleges and universities, but we are also part of a movement within Baltimore City where many of our so-called legacy institutions, museums, cultural institutions, educational institutions, historic sites, and more faith communities are all taking a new look at their pasts and discovering, if you are an institution like the New York Times, which is founded in 1851, like Johns Hopkins, which is founded in 1876, if you have a founding in that era, you're going to discover, of course, that your institution, in many instances, is linked to the history of slavery, of anti-Black racism, and more.
Well, thank you for that grounding, because that moves us into our next question. So many of the educators who are working with the 1619 Project hope to use the content and themes as a springboard for related work in their classrooms or communities. Some have found new ways to incorporate it into existing programs and curricular projects. And so I know part of the Hard Histories Project is a research lab where students get to come and go into the archive and uncover and rewrite these hard histories. And there are other components to the project as well that you've outlined. So could you share a bit about how you utilize, if at all, 1619 Project content or themes in your work in the lab, the project, and public talks?
Sure. One of my way of thinking about the contributions and the legacy of the 1619 Project is that it invites us all to ask new questions, to ask questions that perhaps historians haven't answered, that historians have set to the side. And this is very true in our work at Johns Hopkins. Not all the questions we ask are ones that will rise to the big agenda of, the big historical associations, the professional associations. But what we know is that we are taking our guidance from the kinds of questions that are coming from our various communities, whether it's our students and our campus community, whether it's the greater Baltimore community, whether it is, students and critics of higher education across the country. I think of the 1619 Project as not only answering questions, but really inviting us to ask new ones. And so we went into the work of Hard Histories with some very specific questions about Mr. Hopkins. But as you know, we have gone far afield from Mr. Hopkins over the course of the last 3 years. I was explaining to Kendra while we were waiting for the webinar to begin, Mr. Hopkins, there were 3 facets to his initial bequest that created the university and the hospital. Those are stories that many Americans have some sense of. But there was a third piece to that story, and it was the establishment of what was called an orphans asylum in the 1870s, an orphans asylum for African-American children. No one tells the story of that orphans asylum at the university. Why? We asked why. Why is there a silence? What happens to our story when we resurrect the experience of young Black boys and mostly girls in that institution? And it turns out that it reveals to us the ways in which principles like segregation, worldviews like those that only imagine Black children as workers, just as domestic workers, in a moment when we are building a university for young white men, expecting them to be intellectual and political leaders of the nation. It reveals to us our deep contradictions and the ways in which the legacies of slavery, including anti-Black racism, are very much part of the fabric of our institution. So in some ways, I think 1619 is a thought experiment, right? What happens when we put Black Americans, when we put slavery and anti-Black racism at the center of the story? And I could say the same about hard histories. We are asking what happens when we put Black people, when we put their stories and we put slavery, yes, but anti-Black racism at the center of the university story. And it turns out it changes what we think we knew.
Absolutely. One of the figures you mentioned earlier, Dr. Jones, is Johns Hopkins, and how hard histories was kind of born of this discovery about Johns Hopkins. And as a Baltimore native, I was very aware of the mythology surrounding the man. And I've observed some of the greatest pushback that you've received as part of the project is about this challenging of what we thought we knew about Johns Hopkins. So could you share a little bit more with us about the kinds of pushback that you've received in doing the work at the Hard Histories project, and any advice you have for educators who may be navigating similar pushback in trying to bring to the fore hard histories?
Well, here's a place where the honor that I've had to be affiliated with the 1619 Project and with Nikole Hannah-Jones has been profoundly instructive, because I was able to observe sometimes up close the kind of criticism and the tenor of the criticism that came to the 1619 Project. And so when it was our turn at Hard Histories at Hopkins to face critics, doubters, naysayers, and more, I had a model in mind, and it was the work of the 1619 Project. And yes, Nikole Hannah-Jones, but really the whole team at the New York Times, and that stepped up to affirm the integrity, the value of the project. I like to quote a historian, great women's historian, Blanche Wiesen-Cook, in New York, the great biographer of Eleanor Roosevelt. And years ago, I saw Blanche Wiesen-Cook give a talk to young aspiring historians. And somebody asked her, kind of an ordinary question, which is like, what advice do you give? And Blanche Wiesen-Cook said, get a gang. And I was floored, but I understand what she meant now, right? Which is that, and this I think is for all of us who are in the crosshairs of the wars that are raging around history, and in particular this history, that we cannot do the work alone. This is why we are indebted to organizations like the Pulitzer Center, because we need to be able to see one another, to reach out and touch one another, to stand alongside one another, to have one another's backs. The 1619 Project is very much the brainchild and the vision of Nikole Hannah-Jones. But what we have learned, particularly as the project has weathered criticism, is about the editors, the contributors, the peer reviewers, all of the folks that are essential, that are the gang, right, that make a project like this possible and help it weather difficult times. And I could say the same for our work at Hard Histories, that we have stood firmly in our truth, in our work. We have thought critically about it. We have engaged with critics, but we have not backed away from the things we think we know. And but we don't do it alone. And so in my work, I have the honor of working with young people like you, Kendra, in this work, and the students with whom we have worked together, but faculty and administrators, community members from Baltimore, colleagues at colleges and universities across the country. And that is, in essence, our gang. It is our community of ideas. It is our community of interlocutors. And we are in a moment where everything we can do to be in community with one another, I think is essential, because it is tough work. And on days it can feel profoundly personal, but it is not personal, really. It is about a symptom of the political moment in which we're living. And that's something we share across time and space, and the differences about where we work and how we work.
Yes. Thank you for that, Dr. Jones. So next question for you, as someone who's on the vanguard, get it, of your field, field of history, making waves, certainly at Hopkins with the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project, but doing incredible work, necessary work, to amplify local histories in Baltimore, in Maryland. Based upon your professional assessment, what is the work that lies ahead for us?
I think it is formidable, but I want to say something. I want to say something about what we're building, even in these times of strife. I became a historian, I guess, about 20 years ago, and it was a moment in which I accepted that I would probably spend most of my work life in relative obscurity. There's one of the differences between journalism and history as we used to know it, was that most historians work in a professional milieu. We write for one another, we speak with one another, and only some of us, a relative small number of us, actually broke through or even aimed to break through to bigger audiences. We let our work trickle out into the world slowly. And I was one of those people, frankly. So here we are at a moment, through extraordinary strife, through attacks, through falsehoods and misrepresentations, we nonetheless, if I could say, have the nation's attention. And the question is what to do with that. Right? Our classrooms, our public comments, our articles, our books are winning all kinds of attention. What should we do with that? And that's what I want to emphasize. We need to do something with that. We need to take advantage of this moment to teach, to teach, to teach. One of the ways that I think about my platform through Hard Histories at Hopkins, the platform that I occasionally am able to share with Nicole Hannah-Jones and others through the 1619 Project, is that I am teaching folks in this country to think smarter, better, more critically about historical thinking, about historical research, about the place of history in our national consciousness, in our national identity, in how we think about not only the past, but the present and the future. We are gearing up now for 2026 and the US at 250. And we have an opportunity through this strife to help Americans, certainly Americans of goodwill, to understand how to encounter something as momentous as the 250th birthday of the nation and all of the hoopla, which inside will actually have kernels of history. And I think we have the opportunity to help people think about historiography and about the ways in which historical interpretation shifts over time, about primary evidence and how we go about working the archives to answer the questions that we have, about the ways in which myth and half-truths and even falsehoods exist alongside history. We can help folks to see that, to discern that, to be ready for the next, what I think is surely one of the next nexus points, right, for history, memory, and the nation. So while I think this is a tough time to be a historian, to be an educator, to be a journalist working through history and with history, we are really always planting seeds for what is next. And I think we are not so far now from 2026. And I hope that the folks I teach, the folks I speak with, are taking some of the lessons from this moment and they will bring it to the next one. I don't think it will be possible after the 1619 Project for anyone to credibly tell any story about the founding with having to contend with the history of slavery and its legacies. And that is not only due to the 1619 Project, but I think that is one of the contributions of this project to that not so far off national conversation about the founding.
Wow. Thanks for that, Dr. Jones. I have one more question for you before we open it up to the audience to ask their questions. So audience members, if you are having any thoughts, any things that you'd like to pose to Dr. Jones, please feel free to use the Q&A function to place those questions. So we've spoken, or you've just spoken, about the work that lies ahead. And conversations where we are talking about the work that lies ahead, I think it's also to discuss how it is that we care for ourselves, because we must sustain ourselves in order to continue to do the work. So given the gravity of the work you do, the many things you do, the many hats you wear, how is it that you practice care?
So I'll be honest with folks, I knew you were going to ask me this, Kendra, and I really had to think about it carefully because it's a really important question. And the first thing to say is that I love my work. My work in and of itself is sustaining. There are extraordinary challenges and there is relentless criticism. And yet when I sit down, as you know, to dive into an archive or to read the latest work in my field, to sit down with students and chew on and debate those things, to sit with smart colleagues and debate those things. I love my work. And part of my care is to remind myself that in a culture where, our attitudes and our relationships to work, have shifted and been turned inside out in the last years, I'm just now coming back to remembering how much I love my work and how fortunate I am. And I think foregrounding that for me is part of how I care for myself. I work a lot. You know that about me. I work hard, but that's my pleasure. And I have to own that. And I think honor that. Partly my care is about care for others, and is creating connections and circles and relationships that are longstanding, that are reciprocal. Those might be with colleagues. They certainly are with students. Here you and I are, right, embodying that connection. That is true for my work at the 1619 Project, or with the project and with Nikole Hannah-Jones, which did not begin with my essay, but began with some conversations that Nicole and I had about the early criticism of the project after the magazine came out in 2018, right? And so here, I want to emphasize that this is not advice about career or careerism or how to climb a ladder or how to get ahead. This is about how we have to invest in deep relationships with one another that sustain us, that boost us, that embrace us, that have our backs, that that give us, moments of joy and humor and all the things. And so for me, the most important thing about care is fighting against the isolation, fighting against being singled out, frankly, whether it's for praise or otherwise, right? Not being singled out, often otherwise, always keeping those connections alive. And this is how I think we build community. This is how we weather the strife. This is how we continue to imagine and to realize futures that are distinct from this moment. And we know that, I wrote a book, Vanguard, about Black women's, more than a century long struggle for the right to vote. But those women, what they taught me in part was about the long vision, that we have to be invested in the struggle for the long haul, and we will see successes and we will face opposition, but together they continued that in the face of enslavement, yes, of Jim Crow, of violence and more. And we must do that, I think, together and in community. And again, I want to shout out the Pulitzer Center for creating a space for us in which to begin and nurture and continue those kinds of relationships.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I would like to publicly thank you for your ethic of care, especially when it comes to graduate students. It was an absolute joy working with you during my time at Hopkins, and perhaps the most beautiful thing to come out of that experience is our relationship. I value you, I honor you, and I celebrate you for being as amazing, as awesome, as caring, and as loving as you are. It means mountains to us as graduate students. Well, I'm not a longer graduate student, but that's not important. Okay, so now we're going to pivot to our audience questions. Our first question comes from Blythe, who asks, how can historians who work in other fields of histories, for example, the history of education, interconnect and dialogue with projects such as the Hard Histories Project?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And that has been one of the unexpected gifts of doing this work, is that because partly we are probing the history of higher education, we have developed alliances with historians of education. So I will shout out my colleague, Dr. Andy Jewett, who has come on board at Johns Hopkins University Press to write a new history of the institution from the perspective, from the literature, from the scholarly undertaking that is the history of education. And so I'm thrilled that we will have a history of the university and of the hospital and of the orphans asylum that is not written as hagiography, that is not written as simply boosterism of the institution, but really takes seriously the kinds of questions that historians of education have been asking. I'll plug our webinar series over at Hard Histories because Andy Jewett will be with us later in the semester, along with Ken Lipartito, who is leading an effort in Baltimore to write a new history of the McDonough School. And Mr. McDonough, who we now understand today was a slaveholder and slave trader, is now getting new biographical treatment to help us appreciate differently the origins of that institution, an elite boarding school in Baltimore County. So I think it's essential and exciting for us to be working together. So please come out, join us, and be part of that conversation. We would really welcome it.
Okay, Franklin asks, what mechanisms do you think educators can best use to generate the kinds of transformative or transgressive conversations you suggest in and outside the classroom? We always need more tools.
Yeah. I appreciate this question so much because one of the early struggles in our work at Hard Histories at Hopkins were very different expectations about the timeline for the work. So I would say things like, well, you know, it takes a historian anywhere from 6 to 10, 12 years to answer in depth the kinds of questions that are being posed to us about Mr. Hopkins, about the institution, and all the things that surround it. And you can imagine neither the leadership at the university nor the public, who was really now primed to learn more, were going to give us 6 years or 8 years or 10 years to do that work. So what to do? Well, for a while, I didn't do much because I really had to sit with that. But today, I'm very proud that we've done two things. One is our webinar series, which runs at noontime. So folks can open a brown bag and sit with us, hear from historians, hear from institution builders, hear from students, really pushing out the work we do in real time rather than holding on to it. It's not finished, it's not complete, it's a work in progress, but we've become more comfortable with that. We also, and I'll plug again, we also run a Substack, which is a blog site in essence that also has an email component, but we wanted again to be able to reach folks in real time to talk about our work, but to talk about how it connects to work going on in other institutions, how it's connected to popular culture and more. And here, again, we're speaking in a language and in a style and in a way that is accessible, that for me was very new. So each of us has to, I think, wrestle to find a new comfort zone when it comes to doing the work in real time, making it accessible, giving it the possibility of contributing to real-time transformation. Each of us will find our own ways of doing that, but I think it very much means getting away beyond the classroom or the seminar room. In my case, it means getting beyond books and articles and professional meetings. And this is a new chapter in my work, but one that I really think has given our work a relevance and a force that it wouldn't have if we continued in the old lanes that we previously worked in. So I wish you all the best, Franklin, in finding your new lane with your work.
Yeah. Okay, our next question is from Michael, who asks, what message might I offer my 14-year-old son and other young people who are still being abused at school by having history misrepresented and obscured in light of the current attacks on the truth?
Oh. Thank you for that. And thank you to your son, his friends, and classmates for being committed to thinking historically, even in the face of what I understand are very difficult confrontations in a very difficult climate. It partly goes back to my point earlier helping young people to be connected to one another. You know, I speak sometimes to history clubs and the like, right, in the evening, right, book clubs, alternative spaces where young people and sometimes not so young people are finding one another and being galvanized as they engage with history. So what kind of spaces do we need to create beyond the classroom so that young people feel galvanized, I think is one of the questions that I have been wrestling with, and one of the exciting developments that I've seen, especially through 1619. The book groups just abound, the reading clubs, they just abound. And it's an honor to be there with them. I think for me, there is a story to tell young people about, a long story about the ways in which those who speak truth to power in historical terms have been reviled, have been marginalized, that tragically, right, they are living with and through a profoundly honorable but profoundly violent streak in American history. You know, W.E. Du Bois, the, you know, twice PhD'd, you know, Harvard educated, brilliant scholar, overlooked by the profession in every way. For most of his career, recuperated today, importantly. You know, Carter G. Woodson, again, Harvard PhD historian, who has to build from scratch the Journal of Negro History, what today is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. The great John Hope Franklin, right, who in writing his early, researching his early work is relegated to makeshift tables, you know, in hallways and stairwells because he is Jim Crowed in the archives. Helping young people to see that when they come to history, they are coming not only to knowledge, but really to one facet of our story, struggles against racism and slavery and those legacies, the civil rights struggles that are part and parcel of historians' work. This will not abate, right, what's happening to young people, but I think it gives them a powerful context for understanding who they are in history, and they are very much living in a tradition that we have been working and struggling in for a very long time.
Yeah. Thank you for that insightful response, Dr. Jones. Our next question comes from Bethany, who asks, what advice do you have for educators in places like Florida, where teaching history like the 1619 Project is outlawed? How can we continue to be part of the work ahead?
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Bethany, and thank you for your work. Our best thinking, I hope, has been in these last weeks in particular with you and other educators in Florida, as not only you are struggling with prohibitions against what you teach, you are at the crosshairs of the struggle over the AP course in Black Studies and more. I think that alternative spaces still matter. And that means I hope we see you more at places like this and other convenings where educators are coming together to weather and to strategize through this together, which is to say that there's a great deal to learn here at a day and a half together that need not be labeled the 1619 Project and still can be part of what we teach. My book, Vanguard, was banned in a public library in Louisiana. And I watched as local educators there began to take the book apart, put it back together, find its resonances with the curriculum as it was. And I watched them do that in community, watched guides be produced. So we have that work to do, I think, to think carefully and strategically about where we convene, how we convene, and then how we teach. At the same time, I think that, or I hope, I guess, that you all will come to teach the rest of us. I know that's putting the burden back on you, but Florida has been, as we say sometimes, the canary in the coal mine when it comes to education, in particular for Black history and Black studies, like the 1619 Project and more. So frankly, we look forward to learning from you about how you are managing this moment, because there are going to be many, many more of us finding ourselves, I'm afraid, in similar circumstances before this cycle of strife is done. So again, thanks so much.
Yes. So Dr. Jones, we have one more audience question, and it's from Caitlin. And Caitlin writes, as someone who has been doing the work for over a decade in a K-12 setting, I'm curious, what has been transformational for you as you continue your own development to gain even more depth of knowledge and application?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things, and I'm at least the first of which I think is a thing you know, and it is our students who have questions, and many of whom are not afraid of the so-called hard history at all. I spent a year a little while back affiliated with the Baltimore School for the Arts here in my hometown, and working with the sophomore class on their annual performance, which is built on historical research and then blossoms into artistry. It was phenomenal. But deep into that project, during one of the rehearsals, one of the young men, one of the performers, during the debrief, said to us something that has never left me, which is, why have you kept this history from us for so long? And that floored me, you know, because on the one hand, I wanted to say, wow, they kept it from me too, right? They've kept it from a lot of us. But, you know, I was a student a long time ago. And here was a young man learning the history of Black activism in Baltimore City for the very first time. And it was clearly transformative for him. But he had an accusation to level at us. And I feel like for me, that changed a great deal, because I understood that I couldn't simply write my books or my articles or even teach in my seminar on the Johns Hopkins campus, that indeed the history that I write, the history I work through and with, had been kept from many of us for a very long time. And that is, for me, the key is that has been an active, right? That has been active. It has been kept from us. It's not that it's been overlooked or overshadowed or somehow not the priority. What we are seeing in this moment, right, is folks deliberately keeping that history from us. And this is not the first generation and the first moment in which that history has been kept from us. And I think for me, that has instilled a kind of deliberateness and a much more assertive, right, a way of thinking about what we do as historians, what we do as educators. We're making choices all the time. And part of my job is to prioritize is to prioritize this. I mean, the other thing, I keep coming back to it, is learning to be in community, right? And on the days when I'm flagging, watching someone else, it might be across town, it might be across the seminar room, and it might be across the country, but watching my peers, my colleagues, my comrades step into the breach and championing this. And I think that I feel emboldened by that. And I'm here, right, in part to, in my own way, embolden you all to affirm the struggles that you are not only enduring, but that you are grappling with in your work, and to let you know that many of us are here facing sometimes the same challenges and sometimes not the same challenges at all, but we see you, right? We see you, we see you, we see your students, we see your classrooms. And that for me has been one of the great honors of being part of the 1619 Project, is being part of a collective of folks who have together, right, endured and together struggled. So I hope that being seen and seeing one another is part of how we see everything anew, in fact.
To dream our world anew.
Mm.
Well, we actually have a couple more minutes left. We have one more question come through that I think is an important one, and it's coming from Kenya, who asks, what advice or words of caution or support might you have for educators who believe themselves anti-racist, allies to Black and POC, but do not share the experience or have not done the self-work needed to teach art history? How might they avoid imposing racial trauma or curricular trauma upon their students?
Yeah. I have a small answer and then maybe a bigger one. Sometimes the hardest thing I think about being an educator is remembering to be a listener and not a. There was an exercise somebody taught me when I first started in the classroom that the average, when a teacher asks a question, the average educator waits 1.5 seconds before answering the question themselves, that we hate silence, and we are not patient. And the research was something like, if you wait 9 seconds, which is not very long, but you have to count it in your head. If you just wait 9 seconds, not even 10, someone will raise their hand or, get the conversation started. So I think learning to listen, and I would say, as a person of color educator, there are many things I still need to listen to in my classroom and from my students that are not part of my experience, and that has to do with everything about who I am and where I've come from and where I've been. I was an educator in 9/11. And I had to be quiet and listen to my colleagues, to my students, to the Muslim and Arab Americans in my community. I had to learn from them before I could ever expect to come to a podium and say something meaningful, insightful, valuable, right? So I think that we're all in those shoes to some degree. And helping one another to endure that silence, to listen rather than to jump in and fill the space, is perhaps not the way we were trained, and not where we're comfortable. But I think this continues to be true. My students teach me so much when I'm quiet. I don't know about you all. I like to come in the classroom early and just listen, eavesdrop. I mean, they know I'm there, but eavesdrop, right? And then I have questions, right, about what's in their world. I gave a talk once at the Henry Ford Museum, and I was preceded by a roundtable of high school students. And it was Black History Month. And I was there to talk about Dr. King, I imagine.
Mhm.
And all the young people wanted to talk about were, this is going back 15 years, what they wanted to talk about were the rights of LGBTQ plus Americans. They believed that that was the civil rights question of their generation. And I had to listen, right? And not simply pronounce what the civil rights questions were of the moment. I had to listen. So for me, I think this is still a challenge for us. But I think it is a way forward, yes, for folks, educators who are not people of color, but I think we all have things to learn about communities and concerns and more that are outside our own experiences. That for me is a vision of how we get to transformative.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Jones. This was amazing. You were incredible as always. And thank you to our audience for your thoughtful questions, all the resource sharing, all the conversation that was happening in the chat. We certainly hope that all of you have enjoyed the 1619 Education Conference and received tools and resources you can apply to your own work. Please feel free to share your learning and takeaways from this keynote. You can use the hashtag Teaching1619 to connect with other attendees and participants. For all of the educators in the room, we would love for you to consider applying for our next cohort of the 1619 Education Network. Applications will launch this week on our website and in our education newsletter. And none of this work would be possible without our incredible community of donors. Please consider supporting this work in the Pulitzer Center's mission by visiting pulitzercenter.org/give. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for making this year's conference an incredible success. Be well.